Welcome to Tech Notice. Two 6-core CPUs, i5-12400 and the Ryzen 5 5600X. As a creator, which one is better? Well, let's find out. This video is sponsored by Best Buy and their top deals happening right now. Best Buy is constantly putting out best deals on laptops, tech and even PC parts. Perhaps some even mentioned later on in this video. One of the best deals that stands out for me is the laptop deals where up to $400 can be saved on selected models. The top deals are constantly updated, so make sure that you check out the latest savings through the links in the video description. Regarding PC parts, one of the best deals that stood out for me was the Western Digital SN850 NVMe SSD with a heatsink where you can save up to $100, and a Samsung 980 Pro top deal that saves you $80 on the 1TB model. Best Buy offers a convenient curbside pickup and also a super fast next day delivery for dozens of products. Check out Best Buy and their top deals in the video description below. Now, just a quick little note, this i5-12400 actually has a little bit of a bigger brother, which is the i5-12500. It's not very popular, but Intel just secretly pushed it out and I got it in just yesterday, so I'm benchmarking it just over there at the moment as we're speaking, as we're making this video. So if you want to see that, subscribe to see that comparison. Since we have two 6-core CPUs, let's put the specs on the screen and let's have a look at how do they differ from each other. Both of them have 6 cores and 12 threads, even though Intel's 12th gen usually has some efficiency cores as well. Here we don't have that. We have just big 6 big fat performance cores and 2 threads per core. Now we could look at boost clocks, but boost clocks actually don't matter a thing because we're comparing AMD and Intel and the boost clocks for these work differently. Both of these CPUs are rated at 65 watt TDP, whereas this i5-12400 can actually boost up to like 117 watts and then come back to 65 watts as like the normal, long-term TDP, whereas the Ryzen 5600X just runs roughly around 65 watt TDP. Now, I'm also going to be putting on the PBO specs. I ran all of those benchmarks with PBO enabled as well, just to see if there is a difference. In terms of pricing, the Ryzen 5 5600X is a little bit of a more expensive CPU at the moment. Another huge thing that still separates these two CPUs from each other is that the i5-12400 can actually support DDR5 RAM. And it also has an iGPU inside the UHD 730. Which is basically just a cut down version of the UHD 770 that all the bigger brothers, the 12600K, 12700K, 12900K have. Let's talk about the test bench setups. Both of these setups have an AIO 360mm cooler. The Ryzen has the ROG Ryujin 360mm, whereas the Intel i7 has a Phanteks Glacier 1 360mm AIO. Both of them are Acertec coolers, so I expect the performance to be very, very similar. In terms of motherboards for these, we are using the Asus Z690 ProArt for the Intel, but then MSI X570S Max for the Ryzen system. You've probably noticed that we are running the Intel system on DDR5, 64 gigabytes of DDR5, 4800 megahertz, and it's Kingston Fury Beast, and we're running 4 sticks of 16 gigabytes on it. In terms of the AMD Ryzen, we are using 64 gigabytes of RAM as well, but DDR4, 3600 megahertz CL18. And the RAM for this is from Kingston as well, Kingston Fury Renegade RGB. Now you might be saying, why are you testing the Intel with DDR5 and AMD with DDR4? Well, I think if you have these features, why not max them out? If you have an extra gear or extra feature for this 12400, then let's use it at its maximum capability. Like the same way we're doing with Ryzen, we're putting PBO enabled as well. So we're getting the maximum performance from both sides that supports this platform. To just handicap the Intel with DDR4 wouldn't give us the full performance. Now, I understand that probably not a lot of people will go with DDR5 in this lower version of this, but if you're wondering how much is DDR4 and DDR5 different from each other, then I highly recommend you check out my DDR4 versus DDR5 video, and then you can just see how much the i5-12400 would be lower if you had DDR4. Let's put this there as well. Look, Intel on this side, AMD. I don't have a Ryzen 5 box. Let's pretend this is Ryzen 5. No, I'll just leave it this way so you can't see the number. In terms of graphics cards, both of them use RTX 3090 Asus TUF, and that's all the test bench setups that matter. So let's have a look at power consumption between those two chips. The 12400 roughly pulls, in my testing, I can see roughly around 90 watts at full-on utilization. I can't quite see 117 watts pulled, but maybe you can on a different motherboard. Now with PBO enabled on the 5600X, we're pulling 112 watts roughly on the Cinebench R23, 100% utilization. But when no PBO is enabled, roughly somewhere around 65 to 75 watt pulled from the socket. So then looking at Cinebench R23, the 5600X with PBO enabled basically gains 0% in the single core speeds, but the multi-core speeds increase by about 7%. The 12400 is still about extra 3% faster than the 5600X with PBO enabled, and about 12% faster in single core performance. Moving on to Geekbench 5, the single core is about 1% faster on the 5600X if the PBO is enabled, and about 5% increase when moving on to the multi-core score. The 12400 is about 6% faster in the single core speeds and about 12% faster in the multi-core speeds, yet about 7% difference only when compared to the PBO enabled and 12400 in the multi-core score. Moving on to Blender and CPU rendering. The 5600X with PBO enabled here with BMW rendering scene, we're about 7% faster when PBO is enabled. But the 12400 is even faster on the BMW scene, and we're about 10% faster than the 5600X. In classroom scene, the PBO enabled 5600X is actually 6% faster, yet 12400 is only 3.5% faster, and that's due to the performance clock speed of the i5 12400, where the boost clocks are only there for a limited time. And after that time's finished, it drops down to 65 watts and it's not pulling any more of those, high wattage, which means just lower clock speeds, lower instructions per clock speed, and then it just slows down. And this we can see even more when looking at the Victor score, and the 12400 is 7% slower than the 5600X and about 14% slower when the 5600X has the PBO enabled. So if you're looking for long-term rendering with a CPU, then the 5600X is better in this budget category. Moving on to photo editing and Photoshop, the 5600X with PBO enabled basically gains 0% in the overall score, which is just basically within the margin of error, but the 12400 is about 6% faster than the 5600X. But digging more deeper into the details, the GPU score here, interestingly, the 12400 has 23% increase, and the general score is 15% faster than the competition. But filter scores, they all perform within 1% of each other or within the margin of error. In Lightroom Classic, when enabling the PBO with this chip, we're gaining roughly about 4.5% performance over the stock settings. And here the 12400 is 4.9% faster than the 5600X, but only 0.4% faster when PBO is enabled on the Ryzen chip. And as you can see, looking at the scores here, the passive score is this, where it actually starts to lag down a little bit. And that is the score where you're exporting photos or converting different photos into a different format. So there, the Ryzen chip is much better at doing that, as you can see, than this Intel chip, just because after a certain amount of time, it drops power down to 65 watts on the Intel's chip. But now video editing. In Premiere Pro, the 5600X on the Ryzen gains roughly about 5% when the PBO is enabled, and that's roughly constant across the different parts of the benchmarks. But now the 12400 is 38.4% faster than the 5600X and still over 33% faster than the Ryzen 5600X with PBO enabled. And this is especially high on the standard overall score here and extended live playback. And standard live playback is over 2 times as good as on the Ryzen chip. So basically here now you can see the actual benefit of the iGPU inside this Intel chip, which makes a huge difference. Those encoders over there just kill it for the price of Ryzen, even when running the same dedicated RTX 3090 with the similar settings. It's not even DDR5 that gives you here this much of a boost, only a few percent according to my testing. But the biggest thing is the iGPU inside the Intel chip. In terms of the CPU effect score, the Ryzen is only 5% slower, and when PBO is enabled, we're roughly performing very equal on both of these chips, but the rest of the scores are very much better on this Intel chip. Next off, Adobe After Effects. And enabling the PBO on 5600X, we're roughly gaining about 4.5%. The 12400 though is 12.4% faster than the 5600X, and still about 8% faster when PBO is enabled. Interestingly enough, the multi-core speeds here on the 12400 is actually lower than the Ryzen ones. Overall, in all the other benchmark scores, the Intel chip is actually still better. Next off, Davinci Resolve. And in here, the PBO, next off Davinci Resolve. And when PBO is enabled on the Ryzen chip, we're gaining about 3% performance overall according to my benchmarks over the stock settings on the Ryzen. But here the 12400 is actually just slightly slower than the Ryzen 5600X, and about 5% slower when the PBO is enabled. And here the difference actually is because this test here doesn't quite use a lot of the GPU accelerated or the iGPU accelerated effects. So if you are working with some of the H.265 codecs, then I highly recommend you still go with the Intel chip, because it is much better at playing back those on the iGPU. It's got hardware acceleration for that, which is much better. For example, if you're using, anything from Canon R5 that's 10-bit 422 H.265 codec, then the Ryzen chip is going to be very much sluggish, whereas the Intel chip is just breezing through that through butter, just because it's got hardware acceleration for that. Although on this benchmark, we don't see that benefit so much, and that's why there isn't that big of a difference, because the multi-core performance on this Ryzen chip is much better long term, and that's why in Davinci Resolve it is much better. So in conclusion, the Ryzen 5600X isn't that bad compared to the i5-12400 that might have been praised on the internet with its budget value and very good performance. As a creator, I personally would still choose the Intel over the Ryzen, just because if you're doing any video editing, this is going to be a much better chip on here, and it's actually cheaper as well. The only place where I would consider the Ryzen over the Intel one is if you're doing long-term CPU rendering like Blender, or exporting, passively photos or something like that, that can't just go past the 65 watt TDP on this Intel chip. But in my surprise, the Ryzen wasn't that far behind. Now, I had to run these Ryzen benchmarks again just recently, because they have been changed quite a bit, and some of the programs and things, and the Ryzen is actually tested on Windows 10, but the Intel one is tested on Windows 11, just because I know Ryzen runs a bit better on Windows 10, and the Intel one runs better on Windows 11. So if you're looking for a budget 6-core CPU, then I think the 12400 is a better option. If you want to pick up any of these, I'm going to leave them in the description below. As always, thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. But if you want me to make a certain CPU comparison or add some benchmarks that you didn't see in here, then let me know in the comments below so that I could add them in the future benchmarks. Thanks guys for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.